try to expand our understanding of narratives, of important themes in history, especially by using local stories and stories of traditionally marginalized communities. And so I would like to first start out with an acknowledgement that Essex County, the Essex National Heritage Area, encompasses land on which Indigenous communities have thrived for millennia. The Pawtucket Band of the Massachusetts tribe inhabited the land that is now known as Essex County. Indigenous peoples should not be relegated to history. They're still here and a part of our shared story. As we move towards an equitable future, we will celebrate and continue to honor the heritage of the Indigenous communities that have called this region home for generations. And I'd like to introduce our director, Annie Harris. Annie?
Well, good morning, everyone, and many thanks to St. John's Prep for hosting us here this morning. We really depend on a lot of great partners and delighted to be working with them. If you're not familiar with the Essex National Heritage Area, all of Essex County was designated a National Heritage Area about 25 years ago because of the really extraordinary historic, cultural, and natural resources here, and the organizations that help preserve them and make them relevant today. And Essex Heritage, we're the nonprofit that really tries to connect people and residents and students and the sites and the resources and the nonprofit managers together to really enjoy and celebrate and learn from the incredible history and resources that we have here. Today I want to acknowledge the many partners that have worked with us on this, as well as some of the staff that are here today, specifically Ryan Connery, Charles Smith, Catherine Rakowski, and Courtney Richardson, who are here to help support this program. Would you just wave your hands so everybody sees who you are? Thank you for their work, and if you have any questions, by all means, go and talk to them. I also want to thank and give a very warm welcome to Senator Joan Lovely, Senator from the 2nd Essex District since 2013. And it's really Joan who helped secure the funding for us to go do this program today. So we're really grateful to her. Joan?
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here this morning to just offer a quick hello and welcome. It's so wonderful to be back on the St. John's Prep campus. My husband is a 1969 grad, and my son a 2006 grad, so this school means a lot to us. So congratulations to the students who are here welcoming us as we came in to this beautiful foyer for this really wonderful symposium this morning. Also a shout out to Mr. Newhall, who was my son's teacher when he was here. Charlie, so great to see you. And just, again, pleased to be here to be able to support Essex Heritage and all that you do. Really, just the resources of all across Essex County. Some of my favorites, Baker's Light. I've been out to the lighthouse. If you haven't been out, good weather is coming. The boat will be running. And please avail yourselves. It is just absolutely stunning. And what a history out there. I love Baker's Light. Also, I had the opportunity to go to Saugus Ironworks for the Future Leaders Program to see some of the students who were working there one summer. It was really a wonderful experience. And to see what Essex Heritage is doing with the Future Leaders Program. And again, this teaching history program as well. And this 6th symposium, how did I not know? Excuse me. And just for all of you here today to participate and listen and learn and know what our history is with our history of our revolution coming up. Just really fantastic. So thanks for the opportunity to say good morning this morning and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Annie.
Yes, and in particular, we really want to thank St. John's Prep. They give us this space for free. As Joan mentioned, Charlie Newhall has been the coordinator of this program. He's a teacher here at St. John's. We particularly want to thank him, as well as head of school Dr. Ed Hardiman, and the facilities and tech teams, and also the St. John's Prep History Club, who are in the back, and I think you probably saw them as you came in. That's Jeremiah Douglas Murad, Ben Kisprziak, Harrison Waldman, and Cooper Colby. Thank you, St. John. Charlie, please come up and say a couple of words.
Well, welcome to you all to St. John's Prep. We're really delighted to have you here. When Ryan came forward and asked, and Beth came forward and asked if we could have this event here, I sent an email to our headmaster, Dr. Ed Hardiman, and it was milliseconds he responded and said, absolutely, this is exactly the kind of thing we want to do here at St. John's Prep. And Dr. Hardiman has just been a terrific supporter of history. He's a former history teacher. And in many ways, this is exactly what we all think. My colleagues, I have a couple of colleagues here in the audience, right? What we should be doing, promoting local history and getting our students thinking about it. And all of you do that on a regular basis, so thank you for that. I just want to, again, offer my thanks to Essex Heritage, to Andy Harris, and your whole team. They've just been terrific to work with. That's been great. And also to the St. John's Prep staff, who've just been great. Hector Gonzalez-Villa is here today, Laurel Grady, Dan Monroe, and Mike Evans is not, but the four of those people have put in a lot of time to pull this together. So that's great. And of course, thanks to all of you guys, and you too, everybody in the group for being here. So please have a great day and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Okay, so our agenda today, if you look at the agenda, we do have several sessions. We're going to be starting with a panel that's moderated by Dr. Bethany J, who will be up in just a minute. Then we're going to have a session with area museums and historical societies. So I don't know if you noticed, but there are tables along the edges of our space here, and we have some representatives of some local museums and historical societies who are going to be showcasing some of the resources that they'd like to share with us that have to do with our topic. So that will be the second session. Then we have a session with some students and Charlie, which will be very interesting, and we always love to hear from the youth in our region. We are going to be ordering some pizza, so we'll have a little bite to eat, and then we'll be moving to our last session where we have some teacher exemplars, and that's where you'll be in breakout rooms. So on your name tags, you should have seen a number. That is the room number. That is the breakout space that you'll be going to during that last session. We do have opportunities for educators to earn PDPs, and we'll be talking about that. It's on the website. Basically, you just have to create an activity based on what you have learned today and submit it on our form. And so, I would like to now introduce the panelists for our first session, our wonderful panelists. So, as I call your name, you can just come join us up here. First, we have Jean Pickering. She is a local historian. She wrote a master's thesis on freedom suits filed by enslaved people in Essex County during the Revolutionary period. And she's compiled extensive research on the website northshoreslavery.org. We do have a website, by the way, that, sorry, I meant to say this, that you have a QR code to. And we are still working on compiling resources. One of the sites, obviously, that we're going to be highlighting is Jean's northshoreslavery.org. But there are going to be resources from all of our panelists and presentations and our historical societies and so forth. So you can take a look at that. Next, we have Pam Ellis. She's an enrolled member of the Hassanamisko Nipmuc Indian tribe. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College and holds a JD and Certificate of Federal Indian Law from the Arizona State University College of Law. And among other roles, she served as the tribal historian and genealogist for the Native Nipmuc Indian Council, and she's currently a distinguished artist and scholar in residence at Bunker Hill Community College. We also have Toni Waldron. She's the education coordinator for the Royal House and Slave Quarters located in Medford, Mass. And a resident of Gloucester, she organized the first citywide annual Juneteenth festival and celebration in that city. Currently, she's working on multiple projects under her growing consulting business, Bridges Toward Belonging, and she's coordinating the Gloucester Student Arts Festival for the second year. So that's Toni. Bethany J. She's a professor of history, and she's the director of the History Masters in Teaching program at Salem State University. She's done so many programs with us over the years. She's just a wonderful partner to us, and she's going to be our moderator for this panel. She's also going to be a presenter as a teacher exemplar at the end of the day. So we're thrilled to have Bethany join us as moderator. Dr. J.
Hello. Beth did a nice job introducing those of us who are on the podium here on the stage. But we did want to get a sense of who was in the audience as well. So before I start with my very brief remarks, could we just have a show of hands of who here are teachers? All right. And museum professionals? And community members who are just super interested. Great. This is all wonderful. How many of you have started this work and are here to sort of continue your path? Awesome. And how many feel like this is very new? This is all wonderful. I'm so glad that we have such a wonderful mix of folks that are here. Thank you for taking time out of a Saturday weekend. Luckily, it's not that nice of a day to be with us here today. I'm not saying anything profound when I say that until very recently, the history of the American Revolution has been the story of great white men and their ideas. That revolutionary story has been central to the larger celebratory narrative of the United States as a whole in both museums and classrooms. What I like to call the sort of the country was great at the start and it's been getting better ever since kind of story that we tell. For a lot of people, that narrative never rang true. The revolution did not lead to a society where all men were created equal, and the Constitution protected the slave trade, codified enslavers' rights and the property of enslaved people, offered disproportionate power to enslavers in Congress, and even though it was partly based on the Haudenosaunee governing structure, offered no protections to Native Americans. Which is not to say that the American Revolution accomplished nothing. For 250 years, the ideals of freedom that it established have served as goals and guideposts for those seeking a more just nation. But whatever the American Revolution accomplished, it wasn't on the backs of the founders alone. Women, the enslaved, and indigenous people influenced the revolutionary movement at every turn. As agitators questioning the limits of the founders' definitions of freedom, as allies in protests and on the battlefield, and as potential enemies in combat or on the home front. It is the history of these people that we will prioritize in our time together today, and it is important that we do so. It is important that we recognize not only the existence of those whose narratives have been marginalized, but the importance of their lives in shaping the history of our nation, every part of it, including those parts that we think we know all about, like the revolution. And as we talk about the experiences of women, the enslaved, and members of the Nipmuc and other tribal nations today, I hope that we can use those narratives to tell a different story of the revolution in our classrooms and on our tours. Because their histories should change the way we think about this moment, and not just serve as appendices to the stories that we have always told. Again, thank you for being here to do this work. And now I'm going to get us started on our panel presentations with no further ado, and Jean Pickering, who is up first. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to talk about 4 various actions that enslaved people and free people of color took during the Revolutionary War. And the point I want to make with these stories is that it was these people and through their actions who brought an expanded understanding of what freedom and liberty was going to mean for the revolution. So some of this work has been not done by me, but done by 2 other people who are actually in the audience, and you want to just raise your hand. Lise Breen has done a lot of work, and Beth Bauer has done a lot of work on military service. So Lise is an expert in Gloucester, and she's allowed me to tell a very big story that came out of Gloucester. So I'll start with a nice, warm, sunny day in March of 1776. And Abigail Adams sat down to write her husband one of her newsy letters, and near the end of it, she said, "Oh, it's so nice, and the weather's it's great, you know." And So she got a little she teased him a little bit. She said, you know, while you're off there making up these big decisions at the Second Continental Congress, I desire you would remember the ladies. And this, of course, is something that's been carried down ever since. What's not paid too much attention to is his answer. And his answer is, well, you're making me laugh, basically. And he says, we've been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere. Children and apprentices are going to be disobedient. Schools and colleges are under turmoil. Native Americans, Indians have slighted their guardians, and Negroes have grown insolent to their masters. So my question is, look, why is this funny? If we can understand why this is funny, we're going to learn a lot about really what the great white men of the Revolution had in mind. And in order to understand that, we have to understand how society was organized, how they viewed society as being organized. And it was really a hierarchical system. And at the bottom were not individuals the way we have today, but our households. And each of the households is run by a patriarch. They're usually a household that owns land or it owns a significant business that generates income. And everyone within that household, the wife, the children, the servants, and the enslaved people of color in that household are part of the household. And sometimes they use the word family, but they don't mean family the way we mean it. The society is organized by this collection of property-owning households. In Great Britain, there were then nobility above, noble houses, and above at the top was the king. And the household was supposed to be a miniature version of how the whole society was organized. What the great white men of the patriots of North America were arguing is, we don't need that king at the top. We're going to lock that part off. And all of these property-owning householders, the patriarchs of each of these are going to be deciding how their government will run. So their vision of freedom and liberty and not being slaves was very political, and it's funny because they're being accused of breaking up the household, which isn't at all what they intend to do. So let's look quickly at the early revolutionary period in Boston, which is the period I'm going to talk about. Everyone knows the story, the Stamp Act riots. In 1770 was the massacre. In 73, we have the Boston Tea Party. In 74, the British come in and blockade the harbor. The Continental Congresses start meeting. In 1775, we have the battles of Lexington and Concord. Everybody who lives in Boston knows these stories well. Washington arrives in July. In 76, Martha sits down to write her letter. And then in July, we have the Declaration of Independence. The first action I'm going to talk about is the one you might have run across before, which are that a group of enslaved men in the Boston area sat down and wrote petitions starting in 73 to the legislature, petitioning for the end of slavery, that they should be free. And the famous quote from one of these petitions is usually, "We have no wives, we have no family, we have no country." In other words, they want to become patriarchal householders. They want to be recognized. They want their family, their household to be recognized. So there are several more petitions, but they really go nowhere. They get tabled, and with the second to last petition, Gage dissolves the general court, so it goes nowhere. Their arguments for abolition are the arguments we've all heard: natural rights, religious rights, and legal rights. And they point out there's no law in the province for slavery, and that's generally true. But they're really arguing for their right to be householders, patriarchal householders. So that didn't go anywhere, but it's certainly well remembered and well documented. What's also well documented is the second action that probably was more common amongst people who were getting together to organize something, and that was running away. And running away isn't even a word that we don't use much anymore. We talk about self-emancipation, but all of these things I'm going to talk about are variations on self-emancipation. So what Lisa's done, and I want to just tell the story of Scipio Dalton. Scipio first shows up in Gloucester in a probate inventory. from 1764, and he's valued at 14 pounds, along with his mother and probably his sister. He shows up later when there's an estate transfer to Isaac Smith, from the Low Estate to Isaac Smith. And that includes Scipio, who is listed as 16 years old, although we don't have any verification of that, and his sister. So by 1778, so now this is 14 years later, Scipio is probably at least in his late 20s, perhaps early 30s. And we have, what Lisa's found is an arrest warrant. Now this is not, there was no ad for his running away that she has found, but there's an arrest warrant because he has taken from Isaac Smith a set of clothing, which is common for people who run away. First of all, they have to wear something, but also clothing is easily sellable, right? So they'll be able to get some money to survive on. And he says in this arrest warrant that these clothes have been stolen. He's actually complaining about someone who owns a ship. He says you'll probably find them on the ship, or you'll find them in the ship owner's household, but these are really stolen by Scipio Dalton. Just 2 years later, and this you can find on the Mass Historical website, he signs a 2-year indenture with Isaac Smith. So probably Isaac Smith has realized, I'm not going to be able to hold on to this guy. So if I want to get anything out of him, I better sign an agreement with him. So it's an indenture. It's only for 2 years. And there's a lot of language in there, which Lisa's pointed out in the past, is, he's not going to mumble. He's going to, what we might call cheerful obedience, right, for these 2 years. But it also states that if he should become disabled and unable to support himself, and the town goes to Isaac Smith saying, you enslaved him, you're responsible for him now, that Scipio Dalton will repay Isaac what Isaac has to pay to support him. So I'm not actually sure how that's going to work out, but I think that's a CYA from the 1770s. Scipio, however, shows up in Maine, and he's purchased property in Maine by 1790. He's listed in the census record, the first federal census in 1790 in Pembroke area. By 1800s, he is back in Boston. He owns a nursery business. He is founding a series of institutions for Black people in Boston, the African Society, the African Baptist Church, he's one of the founders of the African School, and he's active in the African Masonic Lodge. So what's gone on here is that he is obviously somebody who's taken control of his life and now is organizing the community that he lives in Boston, and they're becoming a real community with institutions. When he dies in 1822, he owns several pieces of property. He has an estate valued at $850 with mortgages on those up to $1,800. So that's one way in which people could, and I think the very enterprising people, especially men who could get work or could find their way in the society, would bring freedom to themselves, but also to their communities. These are not, some men run away to go to sea, but a lot of men run away to be near their families. And a second way to do that is to go into military service. There are militias. We know that there were people of color and men of color in the militias. Militia service could lead to freedom. It could mean you get freedom. You could mean you don't get freedom. You're serving in your owner's place. Or you could earn money to purchase yourself or to purchase your family. Beth has done a lot of work on looking at Captain Samuel Page's company. And she's found that, she looks at this particular company, there are about 60 men, 10% of whom are of African or Indigenous descent. Some of these people responded to the Lexington Alarm, but really, Captain Samuel Page's company was in a lot of the fights that we're familiar with. Up into the last that we have, their encampment and fortification at West Point, which is, if you remember what happened at West Point, this is where Benedict Arnold finally turned against the United States. All right, so she tells 3 stories, and I'll just briefly go through them. They all show up on a 79 muster roll, And their jobs are the same every other soldier would have, to be on the lines, to be on guard duty. And the first one we want to look at is Caesar Raymond, who actually was someone who had run away. And however that turned out, he ends up in Captain Samuel Page's company, and he dies. He dies in 1777 Methods. So the second is Private Primus Jacobs. He also appears in an earlier bill of sale, who sold to Ebenezer Jacobs, which is probably where he then picked up the last name Jacobs, for 45 pounds in 1754. So this is he's a boy at the time, or called, we assume, a young person at that time. And he goes on to have a 3-year distinguished career and shows up in the Revolutionary War records, which I think there are copies of in the back. Okay? And our third person is Scipio Bartlett. He appears in a probate and estate sale for Widow Bartlett. Widow Bartlett, I guess main name is Bartlett and last name Woodbury. And after the war, he marries, he rents a house, he moves to Salem, and he gets a pension as a Revolutionary War soldier. And so a lot of what we know come from these pension applications. So military service was a second way in which you really other people white people are going to get to know you and see you as a person. It's another way of pushing for freedom. Okay. And he dies in 1828, apparently well known by the people around him. All right, this is my area, freedom suits. There were almost 30 filed in Massachusetts in the 1760s through the 1780s. The three-quarters of them were in Essex County. And what I found was evidence in these court suits that show that people who filed for their freedom did it because they were part of a family, or they had a family member they were trying to protect. So I'm going to tell a few stories. The first one I want to tell is about two people, Violet and Ned Lewis. Ned Lewis is actually Violet's son. Violet is, in her paperwork, in the court case, you can see that she knows her grandparents, her mother's parents, were free and they were in Boston, and that there's a record of their marriage. So she, through her lawyer, and probably through the people she knew in Boston, they managed to get the town clerk to certify that her parents, her mother's parents, were free. This means that her mother, who was born after their marriage, is free. And her mother ends up in Newburyport, and she marries an enslaved man who keeps his African name, which I think is important, Cujo. And they are married in Newburyport, and we have town clerk testify that she was a free Negro when she was born. This when Violet was born. So now Violet is the child of a free woman and a free grandmother, which more than under all custom would mean that she herself should be free, but she's sold when the family in Newburyport, who is keeping her, sells her to a family in Ipswich, and then sells her son in turn is sold to a man in Topsfield. And I think this is what sparks her concern. Now, she wants to take care of not only herself, but her son, who is 16. So she goes to John Lowell, who is going to be the Lowell that we all know, that starts the big Lowell family. At that time, he's a new lawyer. He's working out in Newburyport. His father is the minister who married Violet's mother and father. So I think she went to that minister first, and he said, well, I got this son who's a lawyer, right? And he could probably take her case on. He went on to take 4 more cases of freedom suits. And he convinces, what he does is he writes a letter, he writes a letter to the man who sold her and says, all right, you've got to come up with a proof that shows that you had the right to sell her. The man who owns Violet admits, okay, he doesn't really have rights to her, and actually gives her 20 shillings, almost a pound, actually a little over a pound, in return for her service. She then uses that money, or probably saves up some more money, to go back to Lowell and file for her son, who is now the great-grandson of a free woman. And they file suit against Solomon Dodge, who lives in Topsail, where I live. And he fights it. And he actually wins his case at the lower court, but Lowell takes it to the Superior Court, and this is where all the documentation comes out. And she knows where her mother is. Her mother's married, has a new name. Her mother comes to the trial to testify that she was free when Violet was born. And Lewis wins. He wins 7 pounds and court costs at the superior level. What's interesting, which I don't show here, is a year later, there is a guardianship set up for him, because he's still a minor. And the guardianship includes John Lowell and Deacon Solomon Dodge. So I don't know how that ended up happening, and I don't know what happened to Ed Lewis. The second story I want to tell is about Caesar of Andover. He is the first one who sues because he had an oral contract to purchase his freedom, and his owner has reneged on that contract. So he's negotiated with the man who buys it. Buy me, I will work for you, I will reimburse you. Okay? And then the tailor who agrees to purchase him, his friends talk him into, this is not a good deal, the guy's, you're going to lose your money. So Taylor turns around and sells Caesar without telling him to a local innkeeper and cooper in Danvers. So Caesar goes to Lowell, and they file suit, and they win, but the owner files an appeal, and at the appeal, the owner hires John Adams, who wrote the letter, to defend him. And there's an argument about whether or not the bill of sale that the owner has in his hands, which he did not introduce until the appeal, can be used, and whether or not Caesar can presume to be enslaved. And Adams' argument is he's a Negro. Obviously, he's a slave. He has to prove he's free. And Lowell's argument is that's for property. We're talking about moral beings here. You have to prove that you illegally enslaved him. There are 20 depositions, and this is a big case. I'm sure people are coming from all over the county to file depositions on this, both people of color and white people. And they win. Lowell wins, and he gets $25 in damages, a very considerable amount of sum. So these cases, I think, show people who want to stay here. Caesar wanted to get married, his owner refused him. People want to protect their families. People want to continue living in the area, but they want to be free. And they are not unknown. There are not a huge percentage of people in Essex County who are people of color, but this is going to be very obvious. So, what are the results? There's petitions of running away, of being in the military, and of filing for your freedom. Well, there is a new Massachusetts Constitution in 1780. The second version, which is written by John Adams, has a copy of what was in the Declaration of Independence. And in 1783, this will be the case you'll often hear of, Mumbat or Quack Walker, that this is what legally ended slavery. I think it'd be more accurate to say this recognized the end of slavery. By this point, most people of color have left. They're no longer included in the probate inventories. You don't see any more runaway ads for them, or very many. I think the market for people as property has dried up in Massachusetts for various different reasons. But that doesn't mean things are going well, okay? Because now citizenship, if you're a British subject, you just have to live underneath the king. It doesn't matter who you are. To be a citizen is something different, and it matters who you are, whether or not you can be a citizen. And the force of the war meant that people started respecting those people who resisted slavery. Now, that means white people. That does not mean people of color. And those people who were enslaved and are freed are not seen as really ready to be citizens yet. Quite unfairly, quite really attempting to just disown slavery. That's a famous book about this era. However, we do know that the black people laid the foundations for later abolition work in Boston and around the country. So my argument is that it's actions that changed people's minds. And I think it changed first the minds of the people who were enslaved, gave them new concepts of what freedom meant, and I think it started to change the minds of some small groups of white people, that freedom meant more than just political freedom. So that's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. Those freedom suits are such important work, and it started at Salem State's graduate program, so a little plug for Salem State. I'll turn things over to Panelist now for our second presentation.
Thank you. Kumaba Shinima, Nataswis, Manchana Makasusqua, Indai Nipmuc, Hasanamisko Nipmuc, English Monimi Pam Ellis. Nipmuc means freshwater people. We are the people from the freshwater places, the inland area of what we now call Massachusetts. And Hasanamisko means place of small stones. Our 4.5-acre reservation resides in Grafton, Massachusetts. I've titled what I'm going to talk about today, The Revolutionary War and Indigenous Peoples of Massachusetts. And I wanted to begin by speaking a little bit about my lens, or as it's referred to in many places as positionality, sort of who I am in terms of this conversation. That's a picture of me singing, actually there I'm smiling, I guess, in my traditional clothing. As I mentioned, I'm an enrolled member of the Hassanimisco Nipmuc Indian tribe. My tribe fought for the Americans, or with the Americans, during the Revolution. I'm also the descendant of Nipmuc men who fought in colonial wars. So for me, the legacy of these conflicts is also very personal. I also hold the belief that the United States is still working to realize what I refer to as the aspirational values of freedom, equality, and independence of the revolution for everyone. Some thoughts on language. In speaking today, I will try, when possible, to use specific tribal references. So Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Mohawk, Oneida. My second preference is Indigenous. My third would be Native. My fourth would be Native American, because the concept of Americanness, I think, for many Indigenous people is really a contested one. American Indian, and I guess I was ruminating on this when I came up here because I drove from the Cape. Never good to have like an hour and a half to think about positionality. And I'm a lawyer by training, so I also tend to think in terms of rights, or in terms of legal categories, or sort of organizing the world in that way. And American Indian and Indian are terms of art for people who work in areas of federal Indian law. There are particular legal doctrines that only apply to people who are classified in those categories. Native American would also include Native Hawaiians, as well as Alaska Natives. And some of the doctrines don't apply to people in those categories. So sometimes the use of the term American Indian or Indian is actually a term of art, although I think we all know that someone was lost when people here were referred to as Indian. I actually have just a little story. I was on my way to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. about 30 years ago, and I asked the taxi driver if he knew where the BIA was located, and he said, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he said, absolutely, yes. I got into the cab and I realized that we were on Embassy Row, and I said, this isn't the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he said, Indian Affairs, Indian Embassy.
Yeah.
So anyway, just a little sharing of that story there. Also too, when I name communities, I speak about mission towns and mission communities rather than praying towns, and I don't use the term praying Indian. I think those terms carry with them a lot of baggage, racism, ideas about the cultural inferiority of Indigenous people, that we were not prayerful until the attempts at Christian missionary activity. My sense is that our people have always been prayerful people, and that even after the praying towns ended, and that experiment ended, we continued to be prayerful people. As I mentioned, I have a couple of ancestors who fought in colonial wars. My earliest Nipmuc ancestor is Josiah Speen. Any of you who know the Metro West area and have heard of Speen Street might know that name. He actually served in a conflict called Dummer's War, or the Fourth Anglo-Abenaki War, as a scout for the English forces. The conflict's also referred to as Greylock's War and the 3 Years' War in 1725. Josiah Speen was kin to the Qualla-Lancet, John Speen, who set aside the grant of land for the intertribal assembly of Native people that occurred at Natick, in what is now Massachusetts. In 1719, he was designated a proprietor along with 6 other members of the Speen family. And John Joan, a Minuteman who mustered in from Lancaster, Bolton, and Natick during the years 1775 to 1780, is my 5th great-grandfather. And he was an Indigenous man from Lancaster, and he responded to the alarm of 19 April 1775. His unit that was marching in from Lancaster was unable to cover the distance, and they did miss the Battle of Lexington and Concord. However, they were there for the Battle of Bunker Hill. Like many men who fought in the Revolutionary War, the demands of agricultural life at home didn't cease because of the conflict. And many of them left service to return home for planting, for harvesting, and then they returned. But during their unauthorized leave, many of them were designated as deserters. And John Joan was designated as a deserter at one point, and there was a wanted description printed for him in a paper that I just want to share with you. Because I don't know how many people have this kind of information about their 5th great-grandfather. Deserted from Prospect Hill, Lake of Bolton in the county of Worcester, John Joan of Captain Hill's company in Colonel Finney's regiment in the new establishment, but of Captain Hastings' company in Colonel Whitcomb's regiment in the old. John Joan is a mulatto, but calls himself Indian. About 5 feet 5 inches high, had on a dark-colored coat and a pair pair of breeches, something lighter, has a wife at Holden, a proper Indian squaw. He loves a good deal of rum. So, that's a partial description of John Joan. Some of the detail that's missing from that is that he married my 5th great-grandmother, Hannah Speen, in Natick in 1777. Went on to raise their family, their children, and was listed in the first U.S. Census, the 1790 Census of the United States. He served in the Continental Army for 3 years, from 1777 to 1780. One of the things that I think is important about the Revolutionary War period is that it also provides an opportunity to introduce students to Indian tribes as sovereign nations, and to remember that there are 3 sovereigns in the American or the U.S. political system, that we are talking about the federal government, the state government, and tribal government as well. So I think that this period, and this is not my specialization, I'm sure many of you know this period much better than I do. I actually really focus more on the 19th century, so that's why I made this conversation sort of personal, because this is a bit more about what I know. But this kind of moves into one of the areas that I do work in, and I do think it's really important because a lot of times students don't realize that Native people are sovereigns. And this has to do with the fact that there's inherent sovereignty that depends on pre-existence, the fact that Indian tribes pre-existed colonial presence here, as well as the United States. Also, too, treaties demonstrate this because we can see that these are sovereign government to sovereign government agreements, and the introduction of dependent nation status, which sadly categorizes tribal sovereignty under the U.S. Supreme Court's jurisprudence, draws certain limitations onto tribal sovereignty, but these limitations did not exist during the Revolutionary War period. They weren't introduced until 1831. Indigenous positions during the Revolutionary War, we see alliances with the British for the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Mohawk, alliances with the Americans, with the Oneida Stockbridge, the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, and neutrality was attempted by the Shawnee, Delaware, and Oneida. That did not work out well. As you can see, the Oneida ended up allied with the Americans, and the Revolutionary War split the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. One of the things that's really different, I think, about the way that the Revolutionary War is being taught now, or certainly the way it's being written about by many scholars, is that there's a different historical emphasis. I think that when we look at the question of independence or freedom, for what purpose, one of the things that we really start to look at more deeply is the disposition of tribal lands west of the Appalachians, and the fact that the British engendered a great deal of settler hostility by attempting to protect the lands of their native allies. And that there's a connection between the 7 Years' War, known to many as the French and Indian War, the Stamp Act, and the American Revolution. And Indigenous people really are the connection between all of those things. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the differences or the different emphasis in this narrative about the Revolutionary War, which is quite different from what I learned, just taxation without representation and oppressive colonial rule and independence. But never really looking at freedom or independence for what purpose. And much of that purpose was the desire for westward settlement and expansion, and the fact that the British Crown was attempting to stop that. Protection really was at the basis for alliances with the British. Don't want to spend too much time on that. But I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about why the Nipmucs fought with the Americans. And this is really conjecture on my part, since we didn't really leave a record of that. But the British had not protected indigenous lands in the eastern part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where many of the Nipmucs were located, and in fact had really undermined indigenous sovereignty in the interest of colonial settlement and expansion. I believe that our soldiers fought during this conflict for the protection of our traditions and our homelands, the same things that Native soldiers and veterans have, I think, always fought for. Fighting against the oppressive rule of the British, which kind of goes back to my first point. And it also, going to war was an important alternative to the farming work of the mission towns. Agricultural work generally was in the sphere of women's work within our traditional communities, and fighting wars was something that was definitely within the activities of men. So this would have provided an important alternative to sort of reestablish some of those traditional spheres. And I think that, the fifth reason was fighting for equality, freedom, and independence, and what I would call the power of good minds. This idea of the power of good minds is probably best articulated by the Haudenosaunee people, but it's an important ethical concept for Native people throughout the Northeast. And it's this idea of fighting for principles of, or living with intentionality around principles of equality, justice, peace, generosity. And so how did we make out? Well, in the 1783 Treaty of Paris, the British didn't make, and this is the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, the British didn't make any provisions for the tribal nations that had fought alongside them. The Stockbridge Indians who fought with the Americans during the conflict were forced from their homelands in western Massachusetts and eventually settled in Wisconsin, where their reservation resides and where they are known today as the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe. And despite fighting to create the new country, Indigenous men and women were not citizens of the new country. So despite the fact that we fought to create it, we were not citizens. And it was interesting to me because I was doing some research recently, and I was in the town clerk's office in Natick, and I was looking at tax abatements that were given to my family in the 19th century, in the 1860s. And I was looking at them and I was like, okay, so they're not taxed, because Indians not taxed, okay. And they're not paying a poll tax. Oh, right, they're not paying a poll tax because they're not citizens, they can't vote. And in Massachusetts, depending on who you talk to, and I don't represent any official tribal position here, I'm just talking from my own point of view. Some people will talk about the imposition of citizenship. Some people will talk about the acquisition of citizenship. Really depends on how you look at it, I suppose. But in Massachusetts, American Indians were enfranchised in 1870. And that enfranchisement was an attempt to detribalize us, to terminate our tribes, by making us citizens and attempting to make us another ethnic group in America. But in our resistance to that, our tribes have continued to the present day, and we see ourselves, many of us, as citizens of the United States, citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and citizens of our tribal nations. And that can provide some real legal challenges to the people who have to deal with us. In 1924, there was a federal law that was passed called the Indian Citizenship Act, which made all American Indians citizens of the United States. And some of you might notice that this is after World War I, in which many Native Americans served without citizenship, but fought for the Americans. I think that what the Revolutionary War held out for Indigenous people in Massachusetts was a possibility of freedom and the possibility of independence and a true sovereignty. It must have been very disappointing to realize that those aspirational values would not apply to Indigenous people, and that we would continue to fight and to resist in the service of that, because the end result for me of the Revolutionary War was simply swapping colonial systems, just simply exchanging a British colonial system for a US colonial system. Many of us know that we still live within that, and we pursue our sovereignty, our self-determination, and our self-government, constantly bumping it up against the attempts of colonial government to restrain us. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you for reminding us how talking about our personal stories can lead to larger understandings of history and its continued importance. I'm looking forward also to hearing from Tony Waldron.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. So I'll start by just positioning myself. I appreciate that I actually took that slide out. Now I'm going to put it back in for the future. But my name is Tony Waldron. I am a resident of Gloucester, Massachusetts. But in terms of who I am today and where I stand, I am a biracial woman. I am a woman who was born and raised in England. An interesting position to be here today talking about the American Revolution. I identify in many ways as an independent educator. I've worked in public schools, I've worked for nonprofits where I've developed curriculum in fields of science and civics, and now history as the Royal House and Slave Quarters educator. I also work with my colleagues here today at the Cape Ann Museum as an educator. And I think it's important to list these many hats that I wear, because first and foremost, I will not be on this stage offering you any historical perspective, because the hat that I don't wear is historian. But as an anti-racist, decolonial educator and facilitator, working with youth from K to 12 and adults in my training capacity, I often have to use history as part of that narrative. So let's just go to the next slide and talk about how I feel using that history. First and foremost, I believe history is not neutral. So brought up, both in England and then in America, when I journeyed here, I actually moved to Florida, the great state, where I was educated in everything that was American history in my AP American History class. I use that to teach students about how very little I learned about slavery. Full disclosure, yesterday I was teaching at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, and I toured about 200 students this week. by myself, and yesterday spoke from 9 a.m. until 1:30 straight. For anybody who's ever done a tour, you know you don't stop talking. So my voice is a little strained if it sounds raspy. But as I do lead these tours, a lot of what I'm going to share with you today about how I approach teaching and how I approach guiding students through this narrative really starts with the understanding that history isn't neutral. And I'd like to just share a quote here from a text that was very influential in my own master's program in the cause of freedom, the radical Black internationalism from Harlem to London, 1970 to 1939, not the same period that we were talking about. But in an anthropologist, Michelle Rolfe-Truell asks or implores historians to recognize that silencing occurs as part of any historical narrative, a process spanning fact creation or sources, assembly, archives, retrieval, narratives, and the moment of retrospective significance or the making of history. So according to him, any event enters history with some of its constituent parts missing. Something is always left out while something else is recorded. And I think for me, that is how I go about engaging students with these ideas of wondering, questioning, fact and figure, as I call it, and really allowing, especially the Black and Brown Indigenous students who come through the museums that I tour, to see themselves in alternative ways that maybe haven't been shared with them in records. So here I have a kind of montage of some of the photographs. Clearly, my expertise is not in slide making, but will do. And I want to just talk about some of the programs I've been able to do here. I see one of the photos didn't make it up. In the blank spot there was a photo of students at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, so we'll have to envision that picture. And this summer we were able to do a program with students from Boston Public Schools called In Our Own Hands, teaching them with the help of artist and activist Stephen Hamilton the traditions of natural dyeing, fabric dyeing, and some of the quilting methods that he uses. And then furthermore, these images are all reflections of Black History Month programming that I was able to do this past Black History Month with the help of so many hands that are actually in the room. So I do want to actually uplift those voices too. In the center, what you see there are some sketches that were uncovered in the archives of Cape Ann Museum's library, done by Virginia Lee Burton. And so what I discovered through a series of fortunate events is that Virginia Lee Burton had actually been commissioned as her first paid gig as a children's book illustrator to illustrate a book called The Sad-Faced Boy, which is right there on the table you'll see. And this is significant because in the time in which she would be doing this, we're talking about the 1930s, you know, it was not a time in which there was a lot of integration between Black Americans and white Americans, especially up here where we live in Gloucester and Lanesville, particularly. Virginia Lee Burton was working and living, and she is quoted as saying when she receives this paid gig, well, there are no Black people who live here, so how will I sketch them? Because she also liked to sketch from life. So with the help of my friend, Heidi Warner in the audience over there, an archivist who had helped with our Virginia Lee Burton records and archives, you know, I was able to uncover that in fact we did have all of these sketches that Virginia Lee Burton had done throughout the time of beautiful family life, children, just everyday images of Black and Brown people. And it just begged me to wonder, where was she sketching from? Like, who was she using if we know that this is something she would typically do? It's really something I lift because I found that when I'm doing any consulting work with museums or even in my work as an educator, and just for reference, can I see a show of hands again how many people are educators either in schools or even cultural institutions like museums, but they're even part-time, like do you have a child you talk to in your life? Okay, then you are an educator, okay? So it's just something I want to know in terms of the audience because, you know, when you're working with young people, I think the call to action for an educator is to inspire wonder. Okay, I could have sat up here today and talked to you all about Belinda Sutton and her petition. I really could have, because it's a remarkable story of reparations and freedom seeking, and I could just do 40 slides all about it. but I'm not as good as you, so I did it. And also, you can go on our website, ruralhouse.org, and find that out yourself, right? And you all know how to read. So I don't waste the time with that because I want to inspire people to dig deep and be critical thinkers and to wonder and to ask the questions that they don't even know they need to ask, right? When I'm teaching. And so the through lines, when you're in an organization, whether it's a museum, whether you're at a school, to bring students the hidden stories or the hidden histories, as we've called them, of women, of Indigenous people, of the Black and Brown Americans, free and unfree. It can be difficult because people think that they are not there. And sometimes we have to kind of reach back to archives of, a white, like, children's book illustrator and really wonder about the role that she was playing in bringing forward, Black stories at the time, or just who she was in that moment. One of the kind of mysteries, as Heidi knows, after a few hours in the library archives, I said, how do I get a degree as an archivist? This is great, it's so fun. If you're nosy and you love books, this is great. But one of the little notes that I uncovered was she had just written down the name of a famed African-American author, you may know, Zora Neale Hurston, and she just written it down. Like, it was just written there. And it just made me wonder, like, what is she thinking? What is she reading at this moment? Who is she in conversation with? And these go ways of the open inquiry. Additionally, you'll see some other photographs here. I'd like to uphold some of those or uplift some of those. On the bottom, now we're turned around, so left. Yeah, still left, okay. On the bottom left, you'll see the Freeman House. It is the historic home, now known as the Wellspring House in West Gloucester, where the Freeman family once lived for many years. A free Black family who bought over 80 acres of land in West Gloucester. And we were able to bring that story to life through the support of the Wellspring House, who's done tremendous work uncovering this history and share that at the Museum for Black History Month. Additionally, you'll see that there's a beautiful quilt on the wall beside that image, which is a quilt done by a woman, local artist who is very, very talented. I encourage you to come and see these lovely quilts. They're still up at the Cape Ann Museum, Doris Prouty. And then next to that, you'll see some documentation, indigo dyed fabric on the table in the archives, which is really bringing to life some of those records and archives we were able to uncover through the work of my friends and colleagues in the back corner, hiding so modestly. The ladies here joining us from the Vessels of Slavery Project, who really brought this work to life, or this history to life, as they did their residency researching the history of slavery in Gloucester. And so all of these programs were collaborative. They required the help of others. They required the input of others, the research of others. But it was amazing to be able to put together a program, a robust program, that featured 8 different activities and stops throughout the museum, where only a couple of years prior, the tone of can we put together a Black History Month program was, but we don't have anything, right? We don't have anything. So, I just did it totally not how I was supposed to. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't skip anything. Okay, so how do I lean into the narrative of we don't have anything, right? And I actually realized it was nice to see Reese Reed in the audience, because it was actually one of your amazing talks at CAM, The Forgotten Women, right? Kate Negro, Violet, and Nancy Gardner-Prince, the title of your talk, where I was an audience member and listening to this wonderful research. And something that was said really sparked in me the need to come up with a framework, a methodology to teach. The quote that was shared, and I think it's absolutely fine, was that at times we need to make, quote, reasonable assumptions. And while I do agree with that idea, I knew, just because, we're so focused on language at this moment in time, and rightfully so. Language is powerful, thank you. I thought to myself, I understand what we're getting at with the idea of reasonable assumptions, but the term reasonable challenges me for a lot of reasons. Namely that in a legal sense, the idea, as you know, of reason and rationality is based off of what best suits the dominant party positionality, right? And then assumptions. Now, I don't know, we have some children in the room, so I won't go through what I was told assumptions stand for. But maybe you know, because I was always told assumptions make a out of you or me, right? So I just wasn't comfortable with that language. But I thought we need to take what's being said here and kind of expand it to really help educators. And I came up with this idea of ethical conjecture, right? What are we doing when we are thinking in a speculative way? Well, I think what we're doing is we're wondering, right, about the lives of those who are left out, either purpose or purposefully expunged from history. And when we do that, when we wonder, we actually open the door to inquiry, right? So in terms of our youth, if we're asking them to have questions framed around this idea of wonder, we're also asking them to put the person first, right? Their life first. So you start with thinking of a person and what their life may have been like. And again, it was sparked by being an audience member in another talk. A talk where I actually met the executive director of Rural House and Slave Quarters for the first time, Kira Singleton, at the CAM with Danica Thurston, who's also the executive director of Lynn Museum. And an audience member asked a question pertaining to whether or not, or if or why, enslaved people did not talk to one another about their condition in life. And I mean, any question, as an educator, we know, we welcome all questions. But it did strike me as a little absurd to ask a question about whether or not people talk to one another. I mean, you know, because that was the question essentially. And I thought to myself, well, when we put people first and envision all people as people, then some of these questions don't need to be asked, right? We recognize our shared humanity. So in that way, ethical conjecture for me is the more kind of flushed out version of reasonable assumptions. In terms of a framework that I use as an educator, I love an acronym. And so ACE is how I really try and think about introducing these ideas, right? A lot of educators, a lot of leaders in cultural institutions get uncomfortable when we start expanding narratives or hidden histories because for some reason, empirical truths have been turned into ideology, right? But that's ridiculous because we have empirical truth about the roots of slavery being intimately tied to all of our histories and the founding of America, right? We have empirical truth about Indigenous families and their lands being taken and all of the knowledge that you shared. And so apolitical just means making sure you understand as you step into these narratives, you're not taking a political stance. And I think it's really important to know that as educators so that you can defend the choices you make in a classroom. Because I think in this moment in time, people are trying to make things political that shouldn't be. So I start with apolitical. And then I move to C, or connections. And this is where it can disrupt some of like the frameworks of a traditional historian because weaving or stitching together connections sometimes takes that ethical objective, jumping from one place to another to see how one person's life may be similar to another somewhere else, separate even in time and space. So connections that can be made between the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, for example, which are very clear if you want to make that connection. And lastly for E, and I knew I'd be fastest, so empathy building. Empathy building is a skill that we are constantly, in today's day, trying to weave into any lesson, any teaching moment. Because in a world where we're so disconnected and technology plays such a central role, we have lost the ability to connect, to look at one another and see ourselves and to wonder. So helping students empathy build without asking students to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else, because that is when we get into dangerous territory, right? Simming, subbing, instead really wondering how we all are connected, and that is the foundation of empathy building. That is my last slide. I really appreciate everyone and any questions that come forth. Thank you.
invitation as we make choices about the stories that we tell and the questions we ask, and also the possibilities that come with asking new questions, as Virginia Lee Burton shows us. We do have some time, about 13 minutes, for some questions from the audience for our three panelists. Let's get us started. I can get us started to raise the hands if you want. You all sort of touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that I've noticed most in working with museums and in working with educators is a reluctance or a discomfort to move from this sort of documented record to a story, right? To like a full and coherent kind of narrative. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about how you've made assumptions, conjecture, right? Ethical conjecture based on a documentary record, but also about the context of the larger era, right? And have sort of made that into teachable items or part of your research or work.
I don't necessarily face that discomfort myself. Thank you. I lean into the narrative. It's a really engaging way for students to wonder and see themselves, and also to kind of broaden the narrative, because oftentimes the narrative we share when we talk about the history, and I'm speaking more about the history of Black and Brown people, it's riddled with violence and pain, horror, family separation, indignation. So I just sometimes need to add in something that shows that there's also an essence of survival, of skill, of talent. And so, as I mentioned yesterday, touring 3 groups and really trying to get that stamina to keep going at like the 3rd tour, 12 o'clock, I have to use storytelling because the dates elude me once I start getting to that time. And I see the results, because I say things, for example, about Belinda throughout the tour. And what we know about Belinda Sutton is largely based on the petition that would be filed in her name. Some scholars claim it may have been filed by Prince Hall, which really details her life from the moment she was first captured and enslaved in what we consider to be West Ghana, while praying, she says, to the Orishas with her parents on the River Volta. So she starts with her early life and takes us through the many years of enslavement under the royals before seeking reparations in the form of a pension she is owed. And when you understand the story of slavery, and you understand through records that the royals enslaved the most Black and Brown people in Massachusetts at that time, but most people would have lived with them for no longer than 4 to 6 years, and you look at the fact that Belinda lived with them for about 40 years, you have to wonder why. You have to say, well, why? Because, it wasn't the norm for them to keep the people that they'd enslaved for such a long term. They would gift for various reasons or sell for various reasons, and then you can start to ethically conjecture, and you'll say, or I'll say, things like, well, she was obviously somebody that was highly valuable. She was obviously someone who was highly skilled, and the family would have kept her enslaved at their property for all of those reasons. So you're in the kitchen, and you're thinking about the work of the kitchen. I use the spit jack, which is a device that was invented to, to make beautiful meats perfectly crisp on all sides without somebody having to stand and rotate the spit, right? So we talk about this item that's in the house and why they would have invested so much money. It would have been an expensive thing in a kitchen that enslaved people worked and slept in. Why would it be there? And I share that the insidious reason is because the second leading cause of death for an enslaved Black woman was death by fire, right? So you have to add these things together to get a picture of who Belinda may have been, and then tie in the skill that she would have had, right, in a a state where you get one grow season, you have to preserve food, and you have to be skilled to preserve food. These are the things that I weave in to enrich the story, but I also don't feel as if I'm saying anything out of turn.
Right.
Yeah.
I try to use a lot of primary source documents in the work that I do, especially when I'm working on curriculum development. And I think that the primary source records are important because over time they tell a particular story. So not one isolated record perhaps, but a series of records begin to establish something that it becomes a pattern or that is systematic. And that's something that I'm looking, or I'm seeking to ask people to see.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I guess I'm talking a lot of times from inside the story. I'm not talking from outside. I'm talking from inside the story. And that these primary source records, I can remember the first time that I encountered many of them, especially those that had to do with my own ancestors. I was in the corner of the archive sobbing. And, not just that, like, trickly gracious Hollywood crying, but that, like, stuff that happens when you just can't, like, the breathing. And so, there's a certain trauma for so many of us, just in sort of encountering the primary source documents and what, sort of what we have to fight through. But I think there's something very important, Tony, that you mentioned when you talked about the sort of the qualities of survivance, the persistence, the power, the strength that can also be found in these stories, that I think has a resonance for everyone. And I think it's important to identify those elements, because one of the things that I came away with, and I think it made me cry more, probably more like Hollywood tears as opposed to the other ones, but was just seeing how my ancestors just kept going. Despite everything, they just continue. And with, I believe, some of it being kind of our seventh generational thinking as Indigenous people, that it's not about me, it's about envisioning 7 generations ahead of me, and everything that I try to do and the ways that I attempt to live in terms of an ethical position and posture is for 2 centuries away. And in terms of my life, having to realize that there were people who lived in that way 2 centuries ago, for me to be able to sit here today to talk about what we're talking about. So.
Well, I think the point about facts, is that when you're trained as a historian, that's what you question, are the facts. Why is this a fact? How did this become a fact? And to build a narrative from, especially when you're studying something that is not going to appear in the archives, when they say recross across the archives. I'm looking for the ways in which enslaved people communicated and built relationships, which was that was what frightened white people. They didn't, so the archives are constructed to make that disappear, to make that never have happened. So there's a lot of reading in between the lines. The problem, I think, with building narratives from this is that frequently we build a narrative that we want to tell. And it's, that's why we have the stories of the great men and the patriots, and then because we've wanted to tell that story. Now we want to tell stories of people who are not included in the archives, but we have to be careful that they are not us there. that we have to really question them as well. Who were they? Why are they acting or not appearing? Not assuming that we're, as we've always done in the past, that when we're telling the white stories is that because we want to identify with them, well, they weren't always, now we know, of course, a lot of them were doing things we never wanted to identify with, but that's going to be true for everybody. So you're going to have to look for, who are the people, how are these real human beings in your narratives? And it's not always going to be heroes, it's not always going to be people who even tried to resist, or who even argued against it, or who might have actually turned people in who were trying to resist, if we're going to get a more complete narrative of their stories.
Thank you.
I just want to add one thing, because the slide I took out at the end, because I thought I was going to go over, but I should talk to you first, was the yes and thought. The thought of, exploring with the yes and framework of yes. And it can be complicated, and people can, not resist or stay or whatever we're trying to say. So I just want to agree.
Questions from the audience?
I'm curious about the apolitical part, because I feel it's almost impossible in this time of such backlash to inclusion. And the perception when you're inclusive, you're being political, when really you're trying to tell the hidden story that should be hidden. So I find that really difficult, because you get judged, when you bring in inclusion. So can you just speak a little bit more about how to do that?
Yeah, how I go about that is I live my life with a mantra, which is I won't force anyone to have me answer a question I'm not ready to answer. I won't force anyone, or I won't respond to people who want to tell me that what I'm saying is left, right, blue, red, purple. I'm speaking from within my positionality and what I know and what I've been able to uncover through primary sources and oral histories and ancestral awareness, right? So that's how I move. I just think that we are in a time when people are pushing a narrative that things that happened, that we know happened for many reasons, in many ways, are somehow political, inherently. It's not inherently political to ask I move away from including to belonging. It's not political, it's a human desire to belong. I would just say that if you're in a school, and I have many friends who are teachers, who share horror stories of administrative meetings when they're trying to say, maybe we shouldn't have a luau be the theme for our spring dance. And these are the conversations we're having right now, because there's a growing awareness that what we thought was neutral is not neutral, that we thought what was American tradition is only American tradition for one group of people. There's a great book called See No Stranger. I highly encourage people to read it, by Valerie Kerr. She's an activist, a documentary filmmaker. She's a Sikh woman, and she talks about her years as an activist. She's a lawyer. She went to law school after many years of being an activist. And she just talks about this moment as she gives a birth analogy as a mother. She talks about the birthing process is like painful and you're going through, but there's this light at the end. And I kind of just live with that idea that we are going through the transition of people who have occupied space as neutral, and therefore we've all been asked to be included into their neutrality, having their reality disrupted. And I think that is worth thinking about, because if the ultimate goal is to make space at the table for all to belong, then we need to also understand what people are saying underneath what they're saying, right? Because there's something that's being expressed underneath that. But it doesn't mean I have to lean into it. It's just like, classic teacher redirect.
we all know that, right? So.
I think part of it is that we tend to try to separate out the various different identity groups that we want to tell their history for, which in some ways is we're replicating the separation that was taking place at the time. So, and secondly, that the political part of trying to make it more diverse or whatever is because the original narrative that was political itself. And so, and it's used now for political reasons. So I think the best thing to do is to show the documents. A bigger question is, well, why did the South secede from the Union? Well, okay, there's a whole set of constitutions where it tells you right there, state constitutions, why they did it, and just show those. So just pull out these little facts, show the runaway slave act, show the freedom petitions, show the petitions that were presented to, and this is not Black history, this is the history. And this is what those people that we want to tell their stories, that the larger political narrative wants to tell it, they had to deal with this too. So I'm not a teacher and I don't know how well that would work in an educational environment, but I would say at least pull out the original documents and teach children how to question those.